I'd like to take a couple minutes and go over some stories that we've missed an opportunity to talk about earlier in the week that I originally had planned to cover on Monday or at least by Tuesday, right? Now, some of these may have flown under your radar as well. So if that's the case, if this is your first time hearing about them, I'm happy to deliver. One story that we missed from the weekend's local was the close of the legislative session of the Missouri House. Missouri Independent reports, Missouri legislature, what's up, ends tumultuous 2022 session marked by gridlock, GOP infighting, charter school funding, boost eminent domain changes, largest state budget in history among legislative accomplishments. And boy, doesn't that just look like a party that you want to go to, right? You got to kind of feel sorry for whoever it is who's cleaning that mess. Missouri Independent reports that last Friday, the House passed 20 bills over the course of 6 hours. Wow. When the final gavel fell around 4 p.m., 43 non-budget bills had been passed and were on their way toward Mike Parson's desk. Now, that list includes millions of tax dollars to fund charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City, which undoubtedly will make competition for public school funding even more difficult, as well as create a further strain on public schools' budgets, on staff, which we've already seen in the past. That's one of the big debates on the House floor. This includes new protections for property owners to fend off use of eminent domain by private companies, limits on hospitals, and implementing the type of visitor restrictions imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, which, of course, will open the floodgates for these kinds of limits for decades to come regarding future pandemics. Because let's be real, folks, despite what the evangelical crowd wants you to believe, the world isn't going to end tomorrow, folks. It just isn't. Unless Putin has something to say about that. And requirements for schools to test and filter drinking water to prevent lead poisoning. Now, this is a serious issue all across the country. It's largely ignored. I've talked about it a little bit on this channel, but if you follow me on social media, I've talked about it much more. So look, if you're not following me on Twitter at ChainsawCCC, I don't know what's wrong with you. Now, partly as a result of Governor Mike Parson using his infinite wisdom and his executive authority last year to rip federal tax dollars out of the hands of the unemployed that were meant as part of the COVID relief programs, as well as extra funding made available from a lack of use of the housing relief for renters and landlords that was appallingly poorly implemented last year. The state budget was allowed additional funds for things like tax rebates. As we saw, some of these tax rebates come in the form of additional tax cut for the top 1% all the way down to just above that 34% mark, roughly, right? So look, if you're in the bottom third of Missouri workers, as we heard Republicans say on the House floor in Jefferson City, you aren't contributing to the system. You're just getting a big handful of nothing. Of course, the Missouri GOP was already doing what they could to defund Planned Parenthood with their budget proposals. Republican Senator Bob Onder from Lake St. Louis, whose friends in the House have done everything they can to disrupt meaningful changes up to and including filibuster, procedural maneuvers, according to Missouri Independent. Guy almost sounds like a dirty lawyer or something, right? Now, he's quoted as saying, "We could have done a lot better." Could have done a lot better, of course. What about Bob, right? House Speaker Rob Vescovo, a Republican from Arnold, is quoted as saying, "But let's be frank with each other. They haven't been working in cohesion with each other all session, so who would have said that they would have accomplished anything in the last 24 hours anyway, with all the fighting amongst each other?" Meanwhile, House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid, a Democrat from Springfield, is quoted as telling the Missouri Independent, "The inescapable message of the 2022 legislative session is this: the guys running this place have no idea how to govern." Love it. Couldn't agree more. Now, I did want to share something with you that our friend St. Pete, Representative Peter Meredith, a Democrat from St. Louis City, had shared on social media there. Let me pull this up here. Now, this was posted just days before the legislative session ended. It reads, "Just passed what is probably the worst bill of the year, an elections bill that not only includes a voter ID provision intended to disenfranchise communities that are already the most disenfranchised, and so much else, which I think we know what that means, but a couple of the most appalling new election violations I can imagine. This bill would make it a crime to give someone an absentee ballot application. They claim it's about ballot harvesting, but it prevents a campaign from simply giving out absentee applications to older constituents. It would even prevent someone from giving an application to their grandmother or to her friends at a nursing home. It would make it a crime to get paid to register voters or to let a volunteer help register more than 10 voters without first registering with the state. This is something groups of all types normally do, trying to register voters, especially in communities with low participation. Heck, we've always had booths at neighborhood events with voter registration and absentee applications, and I've hired students to go door to door doing the same thing. All that would now be criminal. These crimes would be election felonies and cause a person to never be allowed to vote again. And even an accusation of such a violation by a campaign would entitle the Secretary of State to subpoena their records in detail and publicly report them under investigation for election violations. Something that might come in pretty handy for a Secretary of State in the midst of a competitive election that wants to target opponents. They've PQ'd and ended debate because the floor leader wanted to go home early. And I didn't even get to point these things out. Meanwhile, I think we spent more time today with folks saying goodbyes and patting each other on the back. And I would interject asses. Than actually debating legislation on the second to last day of session, which is typically a marathon going late into the night working on bills. It's a strange session, to say the least, but I think this bill may be the worst thing that passes this year. Wow. Wow. Good news and bad news from St. Pete to St. Lou. So I guess by that standard, though, most of the Republicans who actually have been caught voting twice, committing other forms of election fraud, hiding ballots and whatnot, that we've been reading about over these last couple of years in Missouri would become felons and lose their rights to own firearms and vote, I guess. So, you know, for the average Trump voter in the state of Missouri, you got to watch yourself during election season. Shocking to say the least. Wow. Do with that what you will. Now I want to move on to something a lot less lighthearted. Now on Monday, I discussed several different shootings, mass shootings, gun-related incidents, either involving attacks on people or in some cases, alleged gross negligence. Look, I don't like it when people call it accidental discharge. It's 2022, folks, not 1882. There is no such thing as an accidental discharge unless we are talking about handling antique relics from an era when that was even physically possible. And one could argue that with knowledge and training, that the possibility of a firearm just going off and injuring someone would just be the result of gross negligence. So call it what it is. All right. But one story I did not mention, and we did not get to discuss, was what happened in good old Springfield, Missouri. Old Springfield. This last weekend. So this story I'm going to tell you is also a piece of the massive wave of shootings that happened in America. That happened during the same week as the 13 shootings in St. Louis, the mass shooting in Buffalo, the shooting, in Laguna Woods, the still undetermined shooting in small town Thayer, Missouri, where a 3-year-old child was wounded and taken to the hospital, shooting near a restaurant in Thayer, Missouri. this was a part of that, and therefore a part of the legacy brought about by the ultra MAGA amosexuals and their hyper masculine arquebus lifestyle push that I've become accustomed to calling it. Let's take a look. Police say 2 dead, 1 injured in shootings in downtown Springfield. Victims identified. KY3, the place to be. Police say 2 people died and another person suffered injuries in an overnight shooting in downtown Springfield. Police say the victims include Malik Sutton, 23 of Springfield, Kyla McGaffey, 20 of Springfield. Officers responded to the shooting before 2 a.m. Saturday at the corner of Olive and Boonville. Witnesses say that they saw the shooter running away from the scene near Water Street. Investigators do not know what led up to the shooting. They believe this was an isolated incident. Police have not identified a suspect. KY3 spoke with a man walking home. During the time of the shooting, he heard the gunshots. We were in a huddle and all took off darting, said Austin Faust. A whole group of my friends that I was walking with when we heard them all sought shelter. Faust says incidents like these are not uncommon. He says incidents like these do not happen, or they do happen. I come through late at night, get off work late at night. We've had multiple occasions of stuff like this, so at the same time, I am used to it. But I always make sure to look out when I'm walking, said Faust. Of course, detectives left a tip line. This incident marks the 5th and 6th homicides of 2022. Keep that in mind, 5th and 6th homicides. I wish Springfield was a better place because we do not have the result. We do not have to resort to violence to solve problems, said Faust. 5th and 6th homicides for the year there. Completely senseless, completely unnecessary. So Kevin Dunn, owner of the Outland Ballroom downtown in Springfield, he had made a statement on social media later, the next day. So on Saturday, he says, I knew both people who were killed last night downtown. This makes 6 people I know who were murdered in 2 months in Springfield. People who had so much going for them. I was just speaking with Pablo Santana yesterday. I heard the gunshots and witnessed the aftermath from the view of 10 stories up. Everyone needs to be careful and get back to your vehicles as quick as possible. Make certain you're always with someone, and I would recommend having protection at all times. Pablo Santana, of course, being the brand name of Malik Sutton. I briefly spoke with Kevin earlier today. He did confirm that both men were also aspiring musicians in the local area. Now, ironically, and I want to pull this up here, ironically, one of the pieces at the Sculpture Walk Springfield that was created by Doug Cox was allegedly damaged as a result of the shooting. The photos were submitted to us by James Flood, also fellow musician, also fellow Asian American. The sculpture reads, pull that up here. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Of course, from the Elvis Costello hit. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? The only thing funny about this is the immense irony wrapped up in an utter tragedy, which itself is the result of completely senseless gun violence. But this is just one of a handful of these kinds of stories that we undoubtedly will continue to hear about and continue to read about. As I mentioned before, Pablo Santana was a local musician as well, so I'm going to go ahead and include a link. This is Pablo Santana with Big Boss Ray.
Oh yes, man. This one for the money. I just sit on roll of wood, just talk a little day, reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name. I just sit on roll of wood, just talk talked a little day. Reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name.
I do whatever in my power to get my nigga back. Went on the mission that shit feel they got my nigga snatched. I pray to God he made it home, but he ain't make it back. Bitch, I can't wait to see the outside. They gon' switch up. Went on the mission, they ain't slide them niggas bitched up. Rah with choppers, big 4-5s, bitch, I be sticked up. Say he was sliding till he died, he just got picked up. Now pick your lip up, why they keep lying? Say they outside and they gon' slide, but they keep dying. You ain't my brother, can't get no ride if you ain't sliding. They say they real, but telling lies, niggas stop lying. Niggas stop lying. No.
I just sit on roll of wood and just talk a little day. Reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name. I just sit on roll of wood and just talk a little day. Reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name. We was outside playing ball with the best of them. When I slide, I'ma slide, get the rest of them. They backdoored you, I can see how that shit happen now. Yeah, they say they love you, look up they Catholic gowns. Niggas scream gang with you. Same niggas that was sliding when that thing hit you. Wish I could've been here to share that pain with you. Go to war, go slide, blow that thing with you. You my nigga that ain't never gonna change. Same nigga, I'ma slide, I'ma die about your name. We scream long live days, we gon' die about you. Fuck the ops, we gon' catch them, take the mind at them. I just sit on roll of wood and just talk a little day. Reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name. I just sit on roll of wood and just talk a little day. Reminiscing about the old times, all the good days. It was me, you, Jeremiah, can't forget about Lil Ray. Now we outside wearing shirts with your name.